In the autumn of 1982, a quiet, invisible predator began stalking the suburbs of Chicago. It did not lurk in dark alleys or wait behind locked doors. It resided in the most mundane of places: medicine cabinets, kitchen drawers, and bathroom shelves. It was hidden within a product that millions of Americans trusted with their lives. The city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware that the boundary between health and mortality had been breached. People went about their routines, reaching into cabinets for relief from minor aches, never suspecting that the bottles they held contained a lethal secret. This was not a threat that announced itself with violence or noise. It was silent, patient, and perfectly integrated into the fabric of daily life. The danger sat on shelves in plain sight, indistinguishable from any other household item. By the time the pattern was recognized, the silence of the suburbs had been shattered. This is the chilling, unresolved mystery of the Tylenol murders. Every home was suddenly a potential crime scene, and every bottle became a source of suspicion. The morning began with the familiar sounds of a suburban household waking up. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman stirred, feeling the onset of a common cold. It was a minor inconvenience, the kind of day that usually ends with rest and recovery. Her family moved through the kitchen with the reflexive care of any household, seeking a quick remedy to ease her discomfort. They reached for a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, a product that sat on the shelf as a symbol of domestic safety. Mary took the capsule, a routine act of healing performed millions of times across the country. There was no hesitation, no suspicion, and no warning. She swallowed, expecting the medicine to do its work. Moments later, the rhythm of the house shifted. The transition from health to crisis was instantaneous. Mary collapsed, her body losing all strength as the poison took hold. The family moved to help, but the change was absolute and irreversible. What had been a simple, caring gesture moments earlier had become a lethal strike. Life had been extinguished in the span of a single heartbeat. In the immediate aftermath of the first tragedy, the event was categorized as a sudden, inexplicable medical failure. The household was left in a state of shock, yet the wider world remained unaware of the danger lurking in the medicine cabinet. The shadow of death, however, was already moving. Shortly thereafter, 27-year-old postal worker Adam Janis felt the onset of a minor discomfort. He followed the same routine that had been practiced in countless homes for years. He reached for a bottle of the same medication, trusting the seal and the brand as he had always done. He swallowed the capsule, expecting the usual relief. The effect was as swift as it was ruthless. Within moments, the routine of his day shattered. He collapsed, his life ending with the same abruptness that had claimed the first victim. The medical community had not yet connected the two incidents, viewing them as isolated, tragic coincidences, but the reality was far more calculated. The poison had found a second target. The grief in the Janis home was heavy, a suffocating weight that filled every room. As family members arrived to offer support, the atmosphere remained thick with the shock of the sudden loss. Stanley and Teresa, exhausted by the frantic hours and the crushing reality of the situation, began to feel the physical toll of their distress. A minor headache, a common reaction, prompted them to seek relief. They did not look for a new source. They turned to the same bottle that had been sitting on the counter, the very one Adam had used just hours before. It was a gesture born of habit and desperation. They each took a capsule, trusting the familiar brand to soothe their pain. The reaction was not delayed. Within moments, the silence of the house was broken by the sound of bodies hitting the floor. Stanley collapsed first, his movements ceasing as the poison took hold. Teresa followed almost instantly, her hand still reaching toward the table for support. The realization was as cold as it was absolute. The medical examiners arrived to a scene that defied all standard protocols. Multiple bodies in one location, all exhibiting the same rapid, catastrophic organ failure, forced a departure from the assumption of natural causes. Toxicology reports were expedited as the death toll climbed. The results returned with a singular, terrifying word: cyanide. The compound was identified in the remaining capsules, confirming that the victims had not succumbed to a rare, contagious illness. The poison was swift, ruthless, and absolute. It left no room for recovery or understanding. This was not a random occurrence of fate. It was a calculated, lethal strike against ordinary citizens. who had done nothing more than trust a household product. The investigation pivoted instantly. The focus shifted from the biology of the victims to the mechanics of the medicine itself. Every capsule was now a potential delivery system for death. The realization settled over the investigators like a heavy shroud. Someone had deliberately weaponized a common, everyday item. The victims were not targets of a specific vendetta. They were casualties of a faceless, cold-blooded experiment in mass poisoning. The domestic sanctuary had been breached. The discovery of cyanide in a common medicine cabinet shattered the unspoken contract of domestic life. For decades, the home had been the ultimate sanctuary, a place where the products on the shelf were assumed to be benign, helpful, and safe. That assumption evaporated in an instant. The medicine cabinet, once a symbol of care and healing, was now viewed with the same suspicion one might reserve for a loaded weapon. People began to look at their own shelves with a new, lingering hesitation. Every bottle, every seal, and every label became a potential site of betrayal. The poison did not just kill the body. It dismantled the psychological safety of the entire household. It forced a terrifying question into the minds of millions. If the most trusted brand could be turned into a delivery system for death, what else was vulnerable? The routine actions of daily existence, reaching for a pill to stop a headache, soothing a child with a familiar remedy, were now fraught with hidden danger. The predator had been invited in, placed on a shelf, and stored in a drawer. This was a direct assault on the quiet, predictable rhythm of American life. The news hit the airwaves like a shockwave. Television anchors broke into scheduled programming, their voices tight with an urgency, usually reserved for declarations of war. They spoke of death in the medicine cabinet, of a silent, invisible killer hiding in plain sight. Across the nation, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Parents rushed to their bathrooms, hands trembling as they swept shelves clean. Of any bottle that resembled the tainted brand, they dumped pills into trash cans, flushed them down toilets, and shoved the empty containers deep into garbage bags to ensure no one else could touch them. It was a mass, uncoordinated purge driven by a singular, desperate need for safety. Retailers felt the tremor of the panic within hours. Managers across Chicago and beyond began pulling thousands of units from their aisles, stacking them in back rooms or loading them onto pallets for destruction. The shelves, once filled with the promise of relief, stood barren and haunting. Every household became a site of frantic inspection. People compared lot numbers, scrutinized seals, and questioned every purchase they had made. The panic did not subside. It settled into a cold, permanent layer of suspicion. Every bottle remaining on a shelf, regardless of brand or purpose, became an object of intense, agonizing scrutiny. People stopped seeing medicine as a solution and began seeing it as a gamble. In kitchens and bathrooms across the country, the simple act of twisting a cap became a moment of hesitation. Was the seal truly intact? Had the plastic been tampered with? The eyes of the nation were now trained to look for the microscopic signs of a killer. Even products unrelated to the tragedy fell under the shadow of doubt. A box of aspirin, a bottle of vitamins, or a container of cold relief, all were handled with the caution one might use to defuse a bomb. This was the new reality. The invisible predator had successfully weaponized the mundane. Every capsule was now a potential risk, and every household was a battlefield of paranoia. The trust that once allowed a person to swallow a pill without a second thought had been permanently severed. The investigators turned their focus to the cold, hard evidence. They traced the supply chain back to the source, examining the manufacturing lines with surgical precision. Every machine was checked, every batch tested, and every worker interviewed. The results were absolute. The poison had not been introduced at the plant. The factory was clean. This discovery shifted the entire investigation into a new, terrifying dimension. It meant the lethal act had occurred after the product reached the public domain. The killer had not needed access to a secure facility. They had needed only the anonymity of a crowded store. Forensic teams began to piece together the timeline, and the picture that emerged was one of chilling, methodical preparation. This was not a crime of sudden impulse or blind rage. It was a patient, deliberate operation. The perpetrator had walked into stores, selected the items, and executed the tampering with a steady hand. They had moved through the aisles like any other shopper, blending into the background while preparing a death trap for the next unsuspecting person to walk by. The realization struck the detectives with the force of a physical blow. The killer was not a ghost, but a person who understood the rhythm of daily life and used it as a weapon. The reconstruction of the crime revealed a process of terrifying simplicity. The killer would enter a store, select a bottle, and move to a quiet corner or a blind spot in the aisles. With a steady hand, the cap was removed, the seal broken, and the capsules extracted. The perpetrator carried a supply of cyanide, carefully opening each individual capsule to replace the medication with the lethal powder. It was a task requiring immense patience and a complete lack of hesitation. Once the poison was packed, the capsule was reassembled, the bottle resealed, and the packaging restored to a state that appeared entirely untouched. The killer then walked back to the aisle and placed the death trap among the pristine, safe inventory. This was a game of Russian roulette, played with the public. The killer did not know who would pick up the bottle, and they did not care. By returning the tampered product to the shelf, the perpetrator ensured that the weapon remained hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next shopper to reach out and make a purchase. Every movement was calculated to avoid detection, turning the act of shopping into a silent, lethal gamble. The map in the precinct office became a canvas of dread. Red pins marked the locations where the poisoned bottles were recovered, and the pattern defied all logic. They were not clustered in one district or limited to a single demographic. The bottles appeared in stores miles apart, scattered across disparate neighborhoods that shared nothing but a common retail chain. This was the geography of fear. The killer had moved with a fluid, terrifying reach, turning the entire city into a single, interconnected danger zone. Investigators tracked the distribution, finding that the threat was not contained to a specific street or suburb. It was everywhere. A shopper in one part of town was exposed to the same lethal risk as someone in a completely different county. The randomness was the most effective weapon of all. It stripped away the comfort of local safety, forcing residents to realize that their own neighborhood store was just as vulnerable as any other. The city had become a landscape of invisible, shifting hazards. Every trip to the pharmacy carried the weight of a potential encounter with the unknown. Just as the investigation seemed destined to remain a hunt for a ghost, the nature of the terror shifted. A letter arrived at the corporate offices of the manufacturer, and the tone of the crisis changed instantly. It was not a manifesto of madness, but a cold, calculated demand for money. The writer claimed responsibility for the deaths and laid out a specific price for the killing to stop. For the detectives, this was the first crack in the killer's armor. The letter provided a tangible lead, a physical piece of evidence that moved the case beyond the scattered bottles and into the realm of human motive. It transformed the mystery from a series of random, inexplicable tragedies into a targeted extortion plot. Investigators seized the document, analyzing the ink, the paper, and the phrasing for any hint of the author. The investigation narrowed its focus with surgical intensity. Detectives traced the extortion demand back to a man named James William Lewis. The pursuit was relentless, a high-stakes chase that spanned state lines and culminated in a tense standoff. When they finally closed the net, the arrest felt like a seismic shift in the case. Lewis was taken into custody, and the weight of the evidence regarding the extortion plot was overwhelming. He was charged, tried, and ultimately convicted. For the attempt to bleed the manufacturer for money, the courtroom victory provided a moment of profound relief for the investigators. Yet it was hollow. While the extortion conviction was a definitive strike against the man who had tried to capitalize on the national panic, the connection to the actual poisonings remained a ghost. Prosecutors could prove he had sent the letter, but they could not place him in the aisles, could not link his hand to the capsules, and could not bridge the gap between his greed and the 7 deaths. The man was behind bars, but the primary mystery remained untouched. The courtroom doors closed on the extortion case, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Detectives sat in the precinct, staring at files that refused to connect. They had a man in prison, yet the true architect of the tragedy remained a phantom. Every lead they followed regarding the actual poisonings dissolved under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. The evidence was a collection of fragments. A fingerprint here, a witness statement there, but nothing that could stand before a jury. The frustration in the room was palpable. They had pushed the investigation to its absolute limit, exhausting every forensic resource. The link between the extortionist's greed and the killer's malice was a chasm they could not cross. It was a bitter, grinding reality. The law had functioned, yet justice for the 7 victims remained out of reach. The trail had gone cold, not because the killer was clever, but because the evidence was forever destined to fall just short of the truth. The investigation eventually ground to a halt. There were no more leads to pull, no more doors to knock on, and no more suspects to interrogate. The killer had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. They had vanished into the vast, anonymous crowd of the city, leaving behind a void where a name should have been. It is a haunting thought. The person responsible may have sat in a living room, watching the very news reports that detailed their own handiwork. They may have walked past the same store shelves they had sabotaged, blending into the rhythm of daily life without a single glance of recognition. The terror did not leave a footprint. It left only a legacy of pervasive, quiet fear. The case files were eventually boxed and shelved. The mystery stayed frozen in time, an open wound that refused to heal. The killer was never brought to justice, and the truth of those autumn days in 1982 remains buried, hidden by the same anonymity that allowed the perpetrator to disappear. The panic that gripped the nation forced a violent, necessary evolution in how products reach the consumer. Before 1982, a simple cardboard box or a loose cap was all that stood between the medicine and the public. That era ended in the shadow of the tragedy. Manufacturers and retailers stood before a stark reality. The industry had to act, and it had to act instantly. Engineers and designers scrambled to develop barriers. This was the birth of the tamper-evident seal. Foil liners, plastic shrink wraps, and glued flaps became the new standard. Every bottle was redesigned to scream for attention if it had been compromised. The simple act of opening became a multi-step process. The trust that had been shattered was replaced by a physical, mechanical verification of safety. These safeguards became the permanent legacy of the crisis, ensuring that the vulnerability of 1982 could never be exploited again. The new seals and plastic wraps are now a permanent part of our lives, yet they cannot bridge the distance to those who died before these protections existed. We must look past the headlines and the policy shifts to the individuals themselves. Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley and Teresa Janus, they were not symbols. They were people who woke up, felt the familiar ache of a headache or a minor illness, and reached for a bottle they had every reason to trust. They performed a simple, reflexive act of self-care. They twisted the cap, poured a capsule into their palm, and swallowed. There was no warning, no hesitation, and no time to understand that the medicine had become a death trap. The transition from life to collapse happened in the span of a single heartbeat. They did not die in a war zone, they died in their own kitchens. This is the scar that remains. Every time we open a bottle today, we are reminded that for those 7 people, the most mundane action of their day became their last. The horror is not just in the act of murder, but in the absolute, silent speed with which their ordinary lives were extinguished. The person responsible for this terror may have been standing in the very aisles where the poisoned bottles were found. They could have been a neighbor, a co-worker, or a stranger in the grocery store, watching the headlines with a gaze that revealed nothing. While the nation recoiled in shock, the killer likely moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who knows a secret that no one else can see. They returned to their own home, sat at their own table, and lived a life that appeared entirely ordinary to those around them. There was no monster-like exterior to mark them, no sign of the malice that had turned a common medicine into a weapon. They may have even watched the news reports of the panic, the police investigations, and the grieving families, feeling a cold, detached satisfaction. This is the most unsettling reality of the case. The perpetrator did not vanish into the shadows of a distant land. They vanished into the crowd. They were a ghost in the machine of daily life, hiding in plain sight, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion that would outlive their own anonymity. The Tylenol murders remain a frozen, jagged edge in history because they expose the terrifying fragility of our perceived safety. We live by a quiet contract of trust, assuming the products we buy are safe. Yet this case proved that a simple, sealed bottle can hide a human hand filled with malice. In 1982, the world learned that terror does not always arrive wearing a face or carrying a weapon. Sometimes, it arrives in a capsule. The killer was never found, and the mystery remains. A stark, uncomfortable reminder that the deadliest thing in the room is often the one thing we trust the most. We are left with an unsettling question that echoes through every medicine cabinet in America. How many others passed within inches of death, never knowing how close they came to the edge? The mystery is not just about who did it, but about how easily our entire reality can be shattered by a single poisoned choice. We remain vulnerable,